Hey guys, Jason Sensational here, back at it again, finally after a little short break from the seasonals to bring you one of the really cool decks that I'm excited to show you guys. And this is Aphelios Kench, which is the deck that rank 1 Kevor brought to seasonals, and this helped him with his 5-0 streak. Now, I was introduced to this deck earlier when we were testing with it, and at first I was kind of skeptical about it because it just seemed like he threw Tahm Kench into a TF Aphelios deck. But boy, was I surprised, and I'm really excited to show you guys what exactly makes this deck kind of stand out from the rest. And so I hope you're excited to really jump into today's deck guide. But before we get started, please drop a like and a subscribe. Really helps me out, really helps the video out, and let's jump right into it. So just starting with the deck list, it looks very similar to Aphelios Twisted Fate. And that's because both decks still operate on the very exact same core structure. The reason why we are pairing Bilgewater with Targon is because we want to be cheating out Boxtopus as a 2-mana 3/4 challenger. And so the very core set of this deck is still exactly the same. You will see about 30 or so cards that really have not changed. You have your classic Bilgewater side of Zap Sprayfin and Wiggly Burblefish, and a 1 of Mind Meld to win games. And you also have your target side, your 3 of Veil Temple, your 3 of Star Shaping, and your other support tools like Guiding Touch, Vigor, Pale Cascade, Hush, and things like that. The main difference, of course, is that we slotted Tahm Kench as the main champion over Twisted Fate. And you'll see exactly why this is so important. But before we get into too much of the nitty-gritty out there, I know Aphelios can be a very complicated champion design, and it's not very intuitive when you first play him on exactly how you want to be playing him. And so for beginners who haven't really had a lot of time to mess around with Aphelios, this is a quick guide on how exactly you want to think about playing him, especially within this deck. So we always want to be night falling out Aphelios. This is very important because if we don't, we are susceptible to start our cycle of moon weapons at a random spot. And that is something very crucial that we do not want. So the best way and the most ideal way to get Aphelios out on curve while still night falling him out is by playing a Lunari Dustbringer on turns 1, 2, or 3. And then we can Dust Petal Dust into Aphelios on turn 3 and Nightfall him out. Now, there will be games where we don't draw Lunari Dustbringer, and we have an alternative way of activating Aphelios the same way. If we play Spacey Sketcher on turn 1 or 2, very crucially that we cannot play Spacey Sketcher out on turn 3 unless we get exactly Moonsilver. And so for that risky option, we always want to be playing Spicy Sketcher on either turn 1 and 2, whereas we have the flexibility to play Lunari Dustbringer on 1, 2, or 3. Now, off of Spacey Sketcher, we are aiming to get either Moonsilver or a Serpent, and having that 0-mana card on turn 3 allows us to continue to execute our game plan with Aphelios on turn 3 as well. Now, a very crucial thing about this exact play of Lunari Dustbringer into Dust into Aphelios on turn 3, it leaves us exactly 2 spell mana. And if we are attacking on odds, which means we are attacking on turn 3, we can also use this 2 spell mana to summon a Boxtopus as a 2-mana 3/4 challenger. And you can start to see where this deck really starts to spiral out of control, because having a turn 3 2/1 3/3 3/4 challenger is absolutely insane. And so for that exact reason, you will most always pick Crescendum as your first weapon. Now, another decision to be made is whether or not we do want to play Crescendum out on turn 3 given the opportunity. And that's not always very clear. Against some decks, a lot of decks will pass because they know you took Crescendum and they don't want to play something out to get eaten alive by the Boxopus. And so at times, if you're burning enough mana against your opponent, then you can take the consideration to pass back and burn all of their mana. Now, another consideration is if you aren't attacking on odds, you're going to be attacking on turn 4, then you don't want to necessarily be playing Crescendum unless you think that open attacking is your best option. Because the way this curve is designed, if you play Crescendum out on turn 3, that's 1 out of 2 triggers to phase into your next weapon that you likely won't be able to activate on that turn, meaning that you'll go into turn 4 with only 4 mana, and it becomes very, very hard for this deck to phase out another weapon on that turn with 4 mana. And so that's 2 things you want to be very, very conscious about when you're deciding to play your Crescendum on curve. Now, because Crescendum is most likely the first card that you'll pick, we'll start there, and your phasing cycle is usually Crescendum into Calibrum into Gravitum, and then back into Crescendum. There will be cases where you want Severum or Infernum, but those are a little bit more niche and just come up when you need them. And so there's no real way of telling when exactly you should phase into them, but it's just more intuition when you get more familiar with Aphelios. And finally, let's talk about why Tahm Kench makes sense in this deck. Because we are in Targon, we have not sacrificed any of our deck building capacities to build around Tahm Kench. We are already running a lot of support cards such as Guiding Touch, Sunblessed Vigor, Star Shaping, and Bastion that already benefit Tahm Kench without having to add them in separately by cutting out other cards. And this is really important because Tahm Kench is just a standalone threat that we didn't have to sacrifice any of our more powerful tools to really build around. Now, we are running 1 copy of Astral Protection, which does synergize very, very well with Tahm Kench, but I think some lists are playing around with just adding 1 copy of Astral Protection as well. Finally, I want to touch up a little bit on Veil Temple because it's a little bit difficult to think about when you're pillaring on 1 unit. If you play Aphelios and before you play Kench and then you want a Temple, in some matchups, you want to be templing on Tahm Kench because its health actually matters, and having that temple to continually buff Tahm Kench gives you a free way rather to infinitely support Tahm Kench's health in order to acquire taste more units. But what makes this kind of difficult is that Tahm Kench only has 2 attack, meaning that if you have a Boxopus or an Aphelios on board, then those will eat the buffs, and your Tahm Kench will not get any of them. And so in the particular matchups where Tahm Kench is one of your win conditions, you have to think very, very carefully about how you want to position your board if you have Tempo in hand or are planning on playing Tempo in the next few turns. And this can be a little bit more complicated, but as you got to play the deck a little bit more, I think this will become a little bit clearer. Now, let's do a quick comparison between Tahm Kench and Twisted Fate and what exactly their pros and cons are for taking the champion slot within this deck. Now, I'm sure everyone is aware of how strong Twisted Fate is, not just because of its versatility of having a blue card, red card, or gold card. Twisted Fate demands your attention because once you level up Twisted Fate, that can sometimes just win you the game on the spot because of its sheer power level to not only generate value and removal turn after turn, it just becomes a absolute monster to deal with. And so if you can't remove Twisted Fate, then the game will likely just snowball out of your favor. Now, compared to Tahm Kench, Twisted Fate's red card can very situationally be used to clear wide boards against decks like Discard Aggro that Tahm Kench will suffer a little bit more into. And because of the way that Twisted Fate Aphelios is kind of built as a deck, you might be running cards like Pick a Card that can help refill your hand in crucial spots if you happen to run out of value, and can, help you come out of a bad situation. But something that Twisted Fate lacks that Tahm Kench really provides for a target Bilgewater deck is the improved interactivity. With Tahm Kench's acquired taste, we can use it to target your opponent's champions, which is something that Aphelios Twisted Fate had a really, really hard time of doing. Having the acquired taste not only is a way to remove your opponent's champions, but just the threat of having a Tahm Kench on board with an acquired taste on hand makes your opponent really think about whether or not they want to be developing into their turn, because this is a very good development punisher. And the third final reason of why Tahm Kench makes a lot of sense in this deck, not only because it doesn't diminish the power level of the deck because we are still being able to cheat out cards like Boxapus, not because it's taking away any of the deck building slots because we are already running a lot of these cards in the deck. It very crucially allows us to play our Twisted Fate in another deck in a tournament such as the Riot Seasonals, because you can only run one champion in one of your decks. And so you can't have two Twisted Fates decks or like two Aphelios decks, for example. And having Tahm Kench as a flexible champion in this slot without really decreasing this deck's power level is a very, very important consideration. Now, I will say that Tahm Kench's interactivity will also make some deck matchups a lot better than having Twisted Fate. So this deck is at the worst as good as Twisted Fate Aphelios, but at best, it can be a lot better. And finally, because the deck itself is very complicated, not only because it is an Aphelios deck, but Tahm Kench as itself, I think, has a relatively high skill ceiling. And so I have 3 games to kind of showcase different aspects of this deck, because there will be matchups in which case Tahm Kench can sometimes be almost unplayable, and some matchups where it will actually provide a very crucial role in the game. And of course, games where Aphelios just really pops off and just crushes the early game and just provides you with a lot of value snowballing into the mid game. And so I have 3 games that I want to showcase you guys. So please stick around for those, because I think that it's very insightful into how the deck plays, and I'll do my best to kind of explain the thought process and each turn as I play them out. But this does end the deck guide portion of the video. And so if you enjoyed that part and if you learned something new, please tell me in the comments, and like and subscribe to the video once again, because I really do appreciate it. And we'll just jump right into the games. So I'll catch you guys later, and I hope you enjoy. So let's jump into the first game here. We are up against an Aphelios Victor deck. So pairing Aphelios with PNZ rather than Bilgewater, which has been working quite well, I think. Aphelios PNZ deck has been doing pretty well in tournaments recently, and having the extra removal tools over like the Bilgewater support, like Boxapus, things like that, has been working pretty well. Unfortunately, we're off to kind of a slow start here. We have the Aphelios in hands, but we don't really have a way to Nightfall him out. So on this turn, I'm playing my Spaces Sketcher, looking to hit either Serpent or Moonsilver to really get Aphelios out on curve. Now, Equinox does the trick, but like I mentioned in the deck guide portion, this doesn't allow us to play out our weapon on curve, but I think ultimately that's fine, because we are still Nightfalling Aphelios out and getting the moon weapon of choice here. So this play isn't great. I wish I got Serpent or Moonsilver, but I have to kind of make do with hands like these. And I go for the Equinox, and I drop the Aphelios on curve, looking for Crescendo. Now, because I had to spend 1 mana on Equinox, I couldn't play out Crescendo on that turn, but I think that ultimately works out for me. because I have 5 mana going to the next turn, and that allows me to phase into the card that I want, which is Calibrum. And you'll see how strong Aphelios can be, because against a board state like his, a card like Calibrum just removes its ballistic bot for free. And now, because he get excited to my Aphelios, I use this Guiding Touch. Not because I can save Aphelios or anything, but just because I really wanted this Calibrum in order to be able to deal with this ballistic bot on the following turn. If I hadn't played that Guiding Touch, I would have been stuck at 1 out of 2 to phase into Calibrum, and not getting Calibrum here is not great for me. So I take this block, even though he's at 2 mana, because I'm sort of familiar with the deck list or the deck archetype. I think most of these decks aren't running cards like Pale, Guiding Touch, or any combat trick cards like that. I was actually able to bait a Thermal Beam out, which means that the second Aphelios in hand has a lot higher chance of surviving. Now, of course, I could have took the 3 damage from the Boxopus and then, you know, challenge it for the next turn or something like that. That kind of does the same thing out. And so by being able to bait out a Thermal Beam onto the Boxopus, which I was really happy about, if that was only like a Mystic Shot, then I would have felt a little bit worse. And then if that was actually a Pale Cascade, I'd probably lose the game on the spot or something like that. Well, not exactly, but it's pretty bad for him to have Pale there. Now, just really quickly talking a little bit more about his deck and why I don't think Victor in particular is a good fit to it. Victor is just a lot of commitment. You're spending 1 mana each turn to buff it up, and against a target deck like mine, I already have 1 Hush in hand, which means that whatever happens to Victor, so long as he doesn't get Spell Shield, I'm not very scared of what can happen to me. And now because I played Aphelios again, I gotta choose what card I want, and so I always go for Crescendum here. Not only because it's a 2 mana 3/4 challenger, but it also thins out my deck a little bit, and that's why cards like Crescendum are so good. Not only because I can pull a 2-drop, but it's actually pulling it out of your deck. So a very similar way in which Zenith Blade is good in Lee Sin. It progresses its game plan, but also is a cycle tool throughout your deck. Now this turns a little bit more complicated because I do want to play this Calibrum and phase into Gravitum, but our opponent isn't giving me that opportunity to phase into a weapon because he has no followers on board. And this is where Calibrum can kind of gum up in your hand, and what makes a card like Tahm Kench really fit into this deck. So I open Pale into this commit, and it eats a Hush, which is perfectly fine. I have 2 Hushes in hand, and so I am not worried at all about this Victor. And so no matter how big the Victor gets, this Victor is not a threat, as long as I have these 2 Hushes in hand. And you'll notice I was able to just get in a lot of chip damage in over these couple of turns with my elusives and a semi-wide board. And that's a very strong way to really win games with this deck, because this deck does kind of lack a win condition. It relies on cards like Star Shaping and a Mind Node with a wide board to close out games. But because you're able to generate a lot of early game tempo with cards like Aphelios into Crescendum, you want to take advantage of that spot to really get forward with tempo. Now, I make a kind of weird play here. I Calibrum my own unit to level up my Aphelios and guarantee that I can phase into a Gravitum on the following turn. But, you know, I don't really want to do that on my own units. This could have meant that he picked a Crescendum of his own, and I just wasted the Calibrum instead of, like, using on the next turn. But because I do have this Gravitum in hand, this punishes any development or any, you know, proactiveness from my opponent. And because he decided to use the Gizmo type of thing to buff his Victor, I can now Crescendum to stun his Victor from the round. But, you know, very crucially, because I do have 2 Hushes in hand, I don't really have to be worried about this Victor like I mentioned before. And so I just take this Daybreak proactively with the Solari Priestess, rather than committing the Crescendum as my first action. And because he developed into it further, now I get an even better Crescendum, so to speak. And I might as well just Crescendum this Victor. Like I mentioned before, it doesn't represent any threat at all, but because I just stun it this turn, I don't need to use my Hush, and Gravitum isn't really getting any better value this turn. And I believe this is my 3rd Boxtopus that I've pulled from my deck already, and so I'm in a really good spot here, ahead on tempo, ahead on Aphelios, ahead in life total, ahead in a lot of things really, even like card advantage. I have 2 Star Shapings in hand, and this can be opposed a very, very high threat. So he uses Severum on his stun Victor, which is a little bit confusing. I suppose it's kind of because he doesn't really have any attack with any of his other units, and he just played it to level up Victor and just begin a phase of Aphelios, which I can see making sense. Now, I begin to pass here a lot, and kind of for maybe not necessarily the correct reason, but because I'm burning basically equal mana to my opponent, and I think that I'm just so far ahead in both board and value, that any mana that he burns is way more important to him than it is to me. And of course, I could be bluffing cards like Sunblessed Figure as long as I keep my mana up, and so I think that is just a very good opportunity to kind of stall out the game more, because I think that I'm winning this game faster than he's able to stabilize. This open attack is a little bit weird. I think that mostly I didn't want his Aphelios to level up. In this case, I'm pretty sure that was the case, because otherwise this Boxtopus isn't really getting any more value if it isn't able to kill this Aphelios. It really doesn't have any more targets on board, especially because I only run 1 Pale Cascade. And so, I also had a decent open attack and things like that. I pass initiative over to him just to see how he reacts, because I think I'm in a much more controlling board state than my opponent. I can afford to play a little bit more reactively and go in for these open attacks. I think in hindsight, developing this this other Burblefish could have gotten 3 more damage in this turn, but over the long run of things, I think I'm just so far ahead that it doesn't really matter. And I just start with a Star Shaping. I think that typically your best pick here is always Living Legends, but because my hand is just so full, Living Legends doesn't really get too much value out of it, and so the decision is between Destroyer and Immortal Fire. Immortal Fire is a little bit weak in this exact matchup simply because of the threat of Gravitum and it not having Spell Shield. So Spell Shield is a really big threat to it because they likely have to spend a Moon Weapon to remove the Spell Shield, which means that they're not gravitating it on that exact turn. And so I think Destroy here is a better pick, even though it doesn't have that elusive keyword. I think my opponent's main decking those Armed Gearheads, which is kind of interesting. I think that it has potential to be a good card in this meta where decks like Ez, Draven don't really see play, but it's just a very interesting inclusion because I think his deck is also very tight on Decklist space and deck card itself. And again, I'm happy passing mana here because I'm just so far ahead in board and hand and everything pretty much that no matter what I do, I think it's very hard to kind of lose this position. And again, I have double Hush for this Victor, so his Victor's never posing any threat. And of course, I had this Gravitum in hand all this time. Now, I could have played Tempo here first, thinking about my mana. I definitely wanted to play Destroyer out this turn so I can have a good open attack again. But I think that just with my mana-wise, I think committing Gravitum here is just fine. If I had to play Hush this turn, I'm not sure I could have played like Tempo, Hush, Destroyer. Maybe I could. I play Temple, then I Hush into Yedison Destroyer. That's 7 plus 4 plus 3 plus 1, which is 15. Oh, I would have had exact mana to do that. But either way, using the Gravitum this turn is better than letting it go to waste, and I wouldn't need Gravitum on the following turn. And so I think Gravituming first makes sense. Now, I figured out that I could play Temple and Destroyer this turn, and it might confuse my opponent into thinking, okay, I tapped under 7 mana, which means I can't play the Celestial card I got off Star Shaping, but that's not actually the case, because I can Guiding into Yedison and actually cheat out this Destroyer with the Temple.
We must walk it.
And again, now my opponent's playing out all his cards. I see that they're not very impactful at all, and I can go in for this play. Yedison likely never matters because you're tossing decks from the bottom of your deck, and I'm not at a point where I'm like close to milling myself or anything like that. And so this play is fine. Even if he removes my Aphelios at this point, I think that's perfectly fine as well. And he has nothing, which makes this open attack really good and hopefully lethal as well. I commit to the open attack again like I was planning on, and I do make a slight missequence that I'll explain as I get to it, but my opponent's committing his blockers, and you'll soon see what exactly I didn't do quite as optimally, but didn't really affect the outcome of the game. So he hushes, I don't really care, I'm still posing lethal damage with the Destroyer and the Elusives, and so he has to do something a little bit more. Now, my opponent, I would also say, makes a missequence of steps as well, but I think likely it wouldn't have affected the outcome as well. And let's see, he puts his Victor at the bottom, which, so for my opponent, the missequence is putting his Victor at the bottom, because if I simply just buffed my Destroyer by 1, which I could do with the Temple, his Victor would do nothing. And so I actually didn't have to use that Hush there, because as long as I played 2 cards this turn, I could buff my Destroyer to deal 6, and because his Victor's at the end of the board, that lifesteal actually doesn't matter. But you know, it didn't really matter in the end, but that's just a slight missequence on my part. And you see how Aphelios really carried this game out with the Crescendums. So second game up against Draven EZ, kind of a deck that's seen a pretty recent decline in popularity, but I think it's actually pretty good into decks that aren't Aphelios. Kind of funny how that is. It's still winnable, but Aphelios and just any target deck in general has so much outvalue opportunity out there. You'll notice that I mulled away Tahm Kench, and for a good reason. Draven EZ aims to push pretty wide with a lot of aggressive 3-drops that Tahm Kench doesn't really trade well into. And even if I get value out of Tahm Kench by fire tasting his units, his deck runs cards like Ravenous Flock and Scorched Earth that can just really make do with my Tahm Kench really quickly and efficiently. And so it's not a very good card in this matchup, and I don't think it ever will be. It can't eat units like Captain Farron, for example, either. So he plays this Ballistic Bot attacks. I don't block because, you know, I can chump out a unit that's bigger than this one attack, and by leaving the Ballistic Bot at 1 health, I don't really have a good way of dealing it with it either. And now, I could have played the Spacey Sketcher the turn before because I had nothing else to do with my mana. Maybe I could have looked for a play on 3, but I didn't for this exact reason, because I had one more chance to top deck Aphelios, and I can Nightfall into Aphelios into Petal, into Weapon type of thing. and I got appropriately rewarded for that play. And so while you're thinking about it, if you have the chance that you don't need to play the 1/1 on that turn, wait out for Aphelios before you discard your pedal. Now again, I took Crescendum on curve, and I didn't choose to play Crescendum and then challenge the bot, swing in for 5 damage, all that jazz, because he could have Ravenous Flock, and then on the following turn, I can't really phase into my weapon that I'd want. And so I think that this was correct. You could have went for it, and then I double spacey Sketcher to proc my Aphelios, and that would have turned out fine. But I think that this play also worked out okay. Now again, yeah, when playing Aphelios, I had to think a little bit ahead, and in this case, I chose not to block the 4/3. I decided to tank that 4 damage because I'm phasing into Calibrum, and Calibrum can kill this 4/3, and I also have heal in my deck with the likes of Star Shaping and Guiding Touch, so taking a little bit of chip damage early on isn't really that bad for me, I would say. And of course, I don't want to calibrate like a 4/3 Sump Dredger after the fact. So Thermo Beam comes out. If I had a Sunblast Vigor, that would have been really, really nice, but that's kind of how the card draws work. I still have the Calibrum to make use of it and attack this 4/3. And, I can hit in next turn for a little bit of damage. So I could use the Calibrum now or last turn, but it doesn't really matter. I didn't really have a good open attack if I wanted to go in for it, and so there's no real point in using it the last turn. Their deck has no way of saving their units, which is also another reason why Aphelios is so good into them. They run a lot of 3 health followers that Calibrum can just always kill. And so, unfortunately, that's also a reason why Draven Ezreal hasn't seen as much play since Aphelios came out. But I think it can still be a pretty strong meta deck that I have found pretty decent success with as well. And because we didn't commit to an open attack, we can safely develop our board, and they don't really have a good way of blocking this elusive Trickster as well. And so, going wide, I have the challenge on the Boxapus. If he only has a Flock and no Mystic Shot, I have the Guiding Touch to heal my Boxapus up to fizzle a Flock, or even like a Scorched Earth if he chooses to go for it. Yep. Alright, and now we go in for the attack challenge, and we get in our damage. So, Static Shock comes out, delays 3 damage from him, it's fine. Killing the minor units doesn't really do too much, he taps out of mana, and I still get in 3 chip damage. I'm ahead on board, which is really important against Draven Ezreal, and I'm in a pretty comfortable spot here. Draven comes out. I have a little bit of decision to make on this turn. My hand is running a little bit light on big threats, and so playing a Star Shaping to get a card like a Destroyer can be really, really beneficial for my current board state and hand state, but it might not be the best way to use my mana, and so I think that on this turn, I'm safe to just Guiding Touch into Zap. I develop a little bit wider on this elusive board, and because I drew into my Wiggly Burblefish, I can now set up a Mind Meld turn, which means I just go really wide with my elusives this turn, and then I open Mind Meld, and if he doesn't have the cards to kill pretty much my entire board, I can just get the chip damage in to win. Again, because I have the Star Shaping here, I don't want to sacrifice my Boxapus and just trade for like an Axe plus a card, and so I'm happy taking this damage here again. We're 2 turns off of a Captain Farron from coming down, and if I can set up a Mind Meld turn this turn and go in for the kill next turn, I don't really have to be worried about Captain Farron to help him close out the game. So we'll see how he commits his attack, and then we'll see what we kind of want to do. I think we're still on the plan of cheating out these burble fishes. Now, of course, we want to play them for 0, and the only way we can reasonably do that while still setting up the mind node is playing this Gifts Beyond into a Crescendum, which of course helps us out by going a little bit wider on board, but also discounts our burbles to 0. I hover over the Crescendum this turn, but ultimately I don't want to go for it. This Crescendum opens up a soft pass opportunity against my opponent, and so I can give him one action before he sees me play down my first burble. Ultimately, I don't go for this mind node just yet after I drew the temple. I don't think it was necessarily... it could have been proper, but because my burbles are only at 6 damage, I would need effective 3 units to go into the opponent's nexus, whereas down a later turn I could only need 2 units to go into the nexus. And so this delaying the mind node a turn or two just makes it a little bit safer, and so that if he does have a lot of removal cards, then I can play a little bit safer. Whereas if I just commit it into this mind node this turn, he drops a fair next turn, I could be in a tricky spot. Scorched Earth comes down, trades the temple. That's unfortunate. This is also another reason why Draven EZ can be pretty good. They are one of the few decks that run very efficient landmark removal, and if your opponent plays Temple on 4 and then you play Scorched Earth onto it, you're up 1 mana and likely ahead in tempo because an Aphelios deck likely isn't very tempo high if they don't draw Aphelios on 3, and so this can open up a wide opportunity for you to really push through. And because my opponent's committed so much of their mana, I feel pretty safe to play these burbles, because of course another reason why Ezreal Draven is kind of weak into these wide elusive burble boards is that their removal costs mana and your burbles do not. And so we have this very stark contrast in board development that is really crucial. So I pulled a Ballistic Bot instead of the Draven, just so that he can't axe kill my Boxtopus, and I want to keep my units alive and be able to go wide because I do have a Mind Meld in hand. If he chooses to, bank mana and kill the Boxtopus with a Flock, he could already kill the 3/4, and so I don't have to worry about him targeting a 3/3, unless he has like at least 2 Flocks in hand, which then I'm a little bit sad about, but it's not the end of the world. Turn 8 is his Farron turn, and so in this case, if he does drop Farron, it's a little bit tight, but because I do have the Starship in hand, I think even if he had Farron, he doesn't have a good way of closing out the game. And because he's committing to this kind of thinking about this open attack, I think it's pretty clear that he doesn't actually represent Farron. And yeah, I'm really happy to see this. I trade down 1 unit because obviously I have some land units, and being able to trade down some of these units means that I have a higher likelihood of my units with the mind mode to go through. And I think that, this is the unit that's weak to Flock, and so by trading it down, I reduce my susceptibility to being units removed before the mind meld goes off. And for the exact same reason, I choose Moonglow here, because it means that this will prevent him from killing a unit through my mind meld. Very luckily, he actually gets an elusive unit, which actually maybe delays, but it makes this a little bit trickier. I think it's actually the Destroyer here, because of course he has his elusive blocker, and the Overwhelm keyword is better than the elusive keyword this turn. I'm still trying to set up this wide board state into open mind mode, because he's running low on mana, he's played a lot of removal cards, and I have this Moonglow in hand if he taps any further. So we'll see what he kind of wants to do here. So he goes for a Rummage. discarding 2 axes, digging for some possibly removal tools. I don't want to commit to this Moonglow just yet, because if I commit Moonglow and he has a Mystic Shot, that is kind of bad for me, because I really need this Moonglow to go off. Funnily enough, I get a Dredger, whatever it's called. Obviously, it doesn't really matter again, like I mentioned last game. Tossing doesn't actually matter for your deck. But now Ballistic Bot comes out, he has no more way of stopping this Moonglow, and this is the time to commit for it. And finally, this is the turn that I've set up Mind Meld for. I could have played the Petal for 1 more proc on it, but that's fine. And this is the open Mind Meld. If he doesn't remove both elusive units, he loses on the spot. And because I actually have this Challenger unit as well, if he doesn't remove both elusives and the Challenger, I also win on the spot. We'll fast forward a little bit here because he thinks about this turn for quite a while. Let's see, he's just... Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So he finally commits all these spells on stack, and it seems that he kind of preparing for this exact turn as well. He Mystic Shots my Zap, he Statics my 1/1 and a 2/1, and then Mystic Shots, he shows me his last card, and he couldn't actually remove the Boxtopus. And so, because my Boxtopus and 1 elusive unit was alive, I have Lethal through his blocker. Unfortunately, I didn't have 1 more mana for this Astral Protection. If I had that, then that's just overkill as well. Now, if he had 1 more mana himself and he had a Scorched Earth, then he would have been alive through this as well. But because he's just straight out of value, and then I had this Destroyer, I was likely to win in the end as well. But still a very close game. This game I set up a really wide mind node and just thinking ahead on how you want to play out your turn. Finally, for our third game, we are up against a Thresh Aphelios deck, which is a little bit strange. The champion pairing is definitely something that's really, really weird and not common, but I think that intuitively it plays out as a control deck. I think that with the Thresh, they're probably playing a lot of like Shadow Isles control tools like Vengeance, Ruination, and the whatnot. And so, if they're a slower deck, I kind of like this on the Solari Priestess as a keep. Finding like an Obliterate or cards like that could probably help out in this matchup a lot. Again, we do have the Lunari Dustbring on 1, and so we're really seeing if we can draw into this Aphelios on 3. Temple is also a pretty good card, especially in an Aphelios mirror, where it's a lot, the matchup is a very value driven, and having that Temple to not only get you more mana each turn, but also that 1/1 plus stat line is really, really helpful. And now, unfortunately, I don't draw Aphelios, and so this Lunari Priestess is the play this turn. Now, I have a little bit of a choice to make. Do I take Sisters or do I take Comet? I think Comet is so very versatile. It'll probably always have hits in this matchup, especially if they start shaping something big. But because my hand is so unit light, and I have this Temple in hand that needs to hit units to buff, I think that overall Sisters is a better choice. Now, I don't attack because he could easily be on a Pale Cascade, and if I do, I'd rather play on the defensive so that he doesn't get in an extra blocker. And so I block here. If he has Pale, he has Pale, but looks like he doesn't, so it's fine. Again, I don't have anything to do with this turn, so I just develop Temple. And this is where Temple can kind of be really good. In slower matchups, you often don't really have a turn 4 play, apart from maybe like a Zap Sprayfin or like a late Aphelios, things like that. Developing Temple out can often snowball your advantage into the later turn. Looks like he has Aphelios, I do not. It's a little unfortunate, but I do have this Boxtopus depending on what he took from his Aphelios. It looks like he's running goats in his deck. I don't really know what other better 2-drop he could pull, especially because he's in Shadow Isles. So it looks like he's at Calibrum. In this position, I would have probably taken Gravitum for this exact reason, because I am a Boxtopus deck, and Gravituming here would basically guarantee that his Aphelios at least survives, and then he could play more control tools on the following turn. I could commit this Sunblast Vigor, or this Guiding Touch, but into like a Pale Cascade or something like that. Or if he's on like a Grasp, I want to bait out the Grasp first and then have like a Guiding Touch on top of it. And so I want to play a little bit more reactively against a deck that's probably very heavy on Shadow Owl's control tools. But knowing that he might have wanted to play Thresh on curve, maybe that was another decision I could have made. Now, I really like this Tahm Kench for two reasons. Because he hooks my Solari Priestess, I can now pillar on top of this Tahm Kench with my Temple, and this Tahm Kench can actually eat this Thresh very, very well. This is actually probably one of the few matchups where Tahm Kench can do really well. And the other matchup that Tahm Kench does well is against other Bilgewater Aphelios decks, into any Lee Sin deck, into Fiora Shen, and has better spreads into Teemo Ezreal. So being able to pillar onto this Tahm Kench makes it very, very unsusceptible to most damage-based removal cards. And unfortunately, his deck might be running cards like Vengeance or things like that, but being able to reset and slow down his Thresh can have a lot of value. And if he isn't running a lot of cards like Vengeance or things like that, then being able to just eat his Thresh for free here, especially having tools like Astral Protection, Star Shaping to heal it back up, makes it pose a very, very likely threat. He poses the Vile Feast, I have the Sunblast Vigor and Temple buff, and we kind of just trade off buffs here. He could play a second card, buff his Temple up, but looks like he chooses not to do it, and I got the 8 on Thresh. He plays second Thresh, which makes sense based on his play. If he was happy letting the first Thresh die, it's likely he either had a second Thresh or a way to at least kill my Tahm, and so that's probably the way you want to think about how exactly he's playing out his turns. Because he's at 4 mana, I'm no longer scared of my Thresh dying, and so I think that using this turn to develop Sisters is a pretty good play. It gives me another blocker, and this 4/3 Sister can start chipping in elusive damage. And he passes, I pass. Burning 1 mana is nice, and we get the Acquire Taste again.
Where there's a will, there's a meal.
And so again, he goes in for the pull, and the block, and the attack. And I have a pretty decent block here, and I want to play reactively just to see what he does, because I have a lot more combat tricks in hand. He probably doesn't have combat tricks, but he does have hard removal, and so I need to be a little bit cautious about that. Hush comes down into... Open a Hush seems weird without a card to follow up. It's very likely to be a card like Pale Cascade, or even a second card just to buff his goat, but it is a Pale. And so this effectively buffs his goat by +2/+2 and draws him a card here. Now I kind of make a crucial mistake here. I can't forget the ordering of how things work, because I think that Bastion actually helps proc it beforehand, but I could be mistaken. I was thinking that if I use this Astral on the Golden Sister, it actually becomes the strongest unit on board and receives a Temple buff, which I thought was the case if he used it with Bastion instead. I'd have to double check, I don't want to be spewing false information out, but this is a pretty poor misplay because I just spent 4 mana to do pretty much nothing. And so that kind of sucked, but there's not much you can do about it. Second Temple again. So it's likely he doesn't have a good way of proccing his second Temple this turn, meaning that I don't really have to be too scared of what exactly he can do. And so I take this turn to spend my mana and use my Star Shaper. Great Beyond seems good here. I think that any big unit with Spell Shield will do fine, because his deck doesn't run Bilgewater. They aren't running Burble Fishes and should have no elusive blockers in their deck, meaning that having any big elusive is probably pretty good. So here's another really cool thing about Temple. well, I don't have to make this play first, but what I was going to say is that because I have a 0-cost Burble Fish, if I play 9 mana Great Beyond into Burble, I actually
Ready
gain 2
room
mana back,
inside.
which lets me play my, it lets me play my, come on, what's the name? Acquired Taste. If my opponent thinks I tapped onto 0 mana because I played Great Beyond and surprised them with a Burble Fish, I could have baited them out there, which likely I should have done. I'm not exactly sure what exactly I was scared about. Maybe I wanted to spread the buffs a little bit more, or actually do the opposite and bait him into spending resources to kill my Tahm Kench so that I could have developed my Great Beyond uncontested. But either way, I think that it kind of worked out in the end. You'll see that he played a Vengeance onto my Tahm Kench to free his Threshes, and I think that anyone looking at this game will look like, well, Tom didn't really do that much. It ate 2 Threshes and then it just released them. But my opponent spent a lot of resources to not only try to threaten to kill the Tahm Kench, but also had to spend 7 mana this turn just to prevent the Tahm Kench from threatening to level up and obliterate his Threshes. And so I think there's a lot of intrinsic value in having Thresh alive on board this whole time. This allowed me to sneak in this 9 damage with the Great Beyond. And of course, in matchups where Tahm Kench doesn't have to fear any hard removals like any SI deck, then Tahm Kench will have a lot higher impact as well. So, this is where I kind of take things a little bit too relaxed. I thought I was in such a headboard state that I kind of got a little bit careless with my plays, or a little bit cocky, anything like that. But you'll see how things go. He gems this goat, which threatens to swing in for 9, which is pretty smart because even if I hit the temple buff on it, it still dies. But because I'm still ahead in health, I have elusives that he can't deal with, I'm fine with taking this 9 damage and just developing my board. I do want to set up for this this Living Legends, and so I just try to empty my hand as much as I can this turn, and if I need to, I can set up the Living Legends, to try to set up another big elusive for him to have to deal with. Unfortunately, he gets Aphelios here, meaning that he gets the Gravitum to stop my elusive, which kind of sucks. So seeing this Aphelios makes me commit into this Living Legends line more, because I need to figure out a way to kind of end the game next turn.
I'm not afraid. Just a wee bit late.
So again, I'm just trying to look to empty my hand here as best as I can, denying him the Vile Feast value so that his Thrushes don't get 1 more unit proc. Could be important, could be not, but I just commit to this. And of course, the Edison again, because I'm not in danger of milling at all. I want to commit this mana now so that I can open with Living Legends. Now, I don't want to save that 1 mana to play Yedison on the next turn, because if I play Yedison into Living Legends, I actually waste 2 mana from the Temple buff. And so this is very important to think about. And see, Gravitum as expected. Because he was also on 1 card in hand, I just thought there was no way that he could stop, whatever was coming out of these Living Legends. But I was a little bit wrong, and maybe that should have affected my play, but you'll kind of see how things went out. So the next card I play this turn will actually give me back 2 mana, so I don't want to play a card that costs less than 2 mana here. So my options here are Phoenix, Traveler, or the Trickster. And because I got my Immortal Fire, I got the card that I was looking for. I think that it's possible that there were better plays, such as like Double Crescent Strike, into baiting him into doing something, and then I can just develop the cheaper units and close the game out. And you'll see why, which 2 cards combo that he drew punished me a lot for the play I took. So he gems the past proactivity back to me. It's a little bit pointless because he knows I'm always going to be attacking this turn. And I try to take out my time. I just buff up my Immortal Fire as much as I can. which is actually unnecessary and didn't play around this exact combo that my opponent's gonna have. And finally, I play down the Immortal Fire, thinking the game's over. I can challenge a few units, and even the units, even if you've Hush blocks my Phoenix, I have a wide enough board state in which I can just kill him throughout, even if he blocks 4 down, right? But no, that's not the case. He hushes, and then he drops the big boy, which is Hush into Ruination. And he had to top deck these 2 cards over the last 2 turns, and this kind of punishes me. It doesn't put me in a bad state per se, because I'm still ahead on value, and he has his 1 card in hand is a Calibrum, right? And so, or sorry, not a Calibrum, a Crescendum, and so I still am ahead on board, and there doesn't seem to be too much need to be afraid, but then he top decks Ledros, and this is where things get a little bit south, because now I need to use this Gifts from Beyond to pull Gravitum in order to even survive this turn. And it doesn't really matter what I phase, because I just didn't draw into Aphelios at all this game, which partially led to this kind of board state. But I also make another misplay here. I know his last card was this Crescendum, and it's likely to pull Goat, but for some reason I decided to play Zap Sprayfin instead of this 1-2, and because if I needed to block this 3 damage this turn, I wouldn't want to block my Elusive. But luckily I draw Guiding Touch, which saves me from this exact instance, and gives me it lets me tank this 3 damage. This Star Shaping is 1 turn too late, as I don't actually have the mana to cast it and play out the threat this turn. If I had it, then this would probably be a different story. Because if I was able to play out this Destroyer or Immortal Fire this turn, the game would just be over on the spot. But this Burrow Fish draw still gives me a little bit of hope, but it's not enough to really sustain myself if he has just any bit of removal. And so now I have to think, what is the card I want to play around here? If I attack into this with a Hush, he'll be alive at 1 health. And so I think that there's merit into playing this this Jailbreak just to get 1 more unit to make sure that I can kill him through a Hush. If he has a Withering Wail, I probably just lose because now I don't have a Fearsome blocker. This block makes me a little bit sad, but it's actually Star Shaping. This guy's been on a tear of top decks. It's actually a little bit frustrating, but that's kind of the way the cards roll. And so this means that he survives this turn again. He's at 8 mana and actually can play out whatever card that he got. Which also poses a really big threat. And so, yep, 10 mana, he could play whatever unit he wants, so we're just fearing for the worst here. But he passes, so it's likely he took Living Legends based on that read. If he had any unit at all, he would have probably played it. He goes for an open attack, which is strange because I have the 2 blockers now, and even if he took like Supernova, he doesn't have a Celestial card to activate it, and this gives me another glimmer of hope. I could play Immortal Fire here, or I could play Temple and set up like a 2-turn lethal. If I play Temple here, I actually gotta buff my Zap Sprayfin up to 3 damage, and this means that I open up 2 lanes of threats. I have the Phoenix threatening lethal, and I have the Zap threatening lethal. But unfortunately, my opponent is just way too good at top decking, and the Atrocity top decks close out the game. So, very unfortunate game. I had that turn where I played into a Hush Ruination, but he just top decked me out in the end.